Forget everything you think you know about end times prophecy. The first seal of Revelation, the white horse and its rider, is not some distant future event. It's being debated right now as a potential reality. From shifting global alliances to widespread ideological crusades, are we witnessing the precise fulfillment of this ancient prophecy? Prepare to have your perspective challenged as we explore the chilling possibility that the first horseman is already on the move. Picture this. A weathered monk in a rough brown habit sits hunched over a manuscript in the year 1312, his trembling fingers tracing words written over 1,000 years before his time. The Book of Revelation, the scroll of seals, the prophecy that has haunted humanity for 2 millennia. His candle flickers against stone walls as he reads about a white horse, a conquering rider, a bow without arrows. What he doesn't know, what he cannot possibly comprehend, is that 714 years later, in the year 2026, millions of people across the globe would be asking the same haunting question he whispers into the darkness. Has it begun? But here's what makes this question different in our time. Here's what separates our moment from every other generation that thought they were living through the end times. We have something they never had. We have the ability to watch conquest happen in real time, without a single arrow being fired, without a single sword being drawn, without a single drop of blood being shed on a battlefield. And that, my friends, is precisely what makes the symbolism of the first seal so terrifyingly relevant right now. Let me take you back to the source. The Book of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 2. John of Patmos, exiled on a rocky island in the Aegean Sea, describes his vision. And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering, and to conquer. 14 words in the original Greek. 14 words that have sparked countless interpretations, launched crusades, inspired reformations, and terrified generations. But here's the detail that changes everything. The detail that makes scholars lean forward in their chairs and theologians pause mid-sentence. The bow has no arrows. Think about that impossibility for a moment. A conquering rider with a weapon that cannot wound, a victor who subdues without violence. How do you conquer entire nations, reshape the political landscape of the known world, bring populations to their knees, all while holding an empty bow? The ancient world knew only one kind of conquest, the conquest of blood and iron, of shields splintering and castles falling, of battlefields soaked red and cities burned to ash. So what kind of conquest did John foresee? What kind of victory happens without war? Fast forward to the year 2026, right now, this moment. We live in an era where the most powerful conquests happen not on battlefields, but in the invisible realm of information, ideology, and influence. A single viral narrative can topple governments without a single soldier crossing a border. A carefully orchestrated propaganda campaign can reshape the beliefs of 300 million people without a single shot being fired. Economic sanctions can bring a nation to its knees more effectively than any siege engine from medieval times. Are you beginning to see the connection? Are you starting to understand why the image of a bow without arrows suddenly feels less like ancient symbolism and more like tomorrow's headlines? Let's examine the evidence with the cold precision of investigators, not the fervor of fanatics. The year 2024 marked a watershed moment in global power dynamics. Traditional alliances that had stood firm since 1945 began fracturing along new ideological lines. Nations that had been adversaries for 70 years suddenly found common cause. Blocs that seemed permanent dissolved overnight. And here's the crucial detail. Most of this realignment happened not through military conflict, but through economic partnerships, technological dependencies, and the slow, steady drip of narrative control. Conquest without arrows, victory without bloodshed. Consider the rise of what political scientists call sharp power, a term coined in 2017, but reaching its apex in our current moment. Unlike soft power, which wins hearts and minds through cultural appeal, sharp power penetrates, divides, and manipulates. It's the difference between inspiring people to adopt your values and controlling the information environment so thoroughly that people don't realize they're being conquered at all. 47 nations currently employ dedicated departments for international narrative shaping. 83% of global internet traffic passes through infrastructure controlled by just 6 countries. Does this sound like the kind of subtle, pervasive conquest that a rider with an empty bow might achieve? But wait, before you dismiss this as political commentary masquerading as prophecy interpretation, let me show you something that will make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The white horse. In ancient Near Eastern symbolism, in the very cultural context where John received his vision, white horses had a specific meaning. They were not symbols of purity or righteousness, as later Christian tradition would assume. They were the mounts of victorious generals in Roman triumphal processions. They represented military conquest, yes, but more importantly, they represented the theater of conquest, the pageantry of victory, the public display of dominance. They were propaganda on 4 legs. Now look at our modern world. How much of contemporary geopolitical maneuvering is actually about the theater of power rather than power itself? How many military exercises are designed not to prepare for war, but to send messages? How many treaties are signed not for their practical benefits, but for their symbolic weight? We live in an age where perception management has become more important than actual capability. A carefully staged summit can accomplish more than 10,000 troops on a border. An orchestrated social media campaign can destabilize a regime more effectively than a coup d'etat. The white horse isn't charging into battle. It's parading through the streets while cameras capture every step. Let me take you deeper into the symbolism, because this is where it gets truly unsettling. The text says, "A crown was given unto him." Not seized, not earned through conquest, given, handed over. This is passive voice in the original Greek, indicating that the authority comes from elsewhere, from above, from forces the rider himself does not fully control. Throughout history, would-be prophetic interpreters have missed this crucial detail in their rush to identify the Antichrist or the false prophet. But what if the emphasis isn't on who the rider is, but on the nature of the authority he wields? What if we're witnessing the consolidation of power structures, where authority is being transferred, realigned, concentrated in ways that transcend individual leaders or nations? Think about the global governance structures that have emerged in just the past 20 years. International bodies with no democratic accountability making decisions that affect billions of lives. Public-private partnerships where the line between governmental authority and corporate power has become so blurred as to be meaningless. Multilateral agreements that supersede national sovereignty, signed by officials most citizens couldn't name, enforced through mechanisms most people don't understand. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented reality. The crown is being given, power is being transferred, and the majority of humanity watches it happen without recognizing the transformation taking place before their eyes. Now let's talk about false peace, because this is where the prophetic description becomes almost too precise to be comfortable. The first horseman goes forth, conquering and to conquer. Present tense and future infinitive in Greek, implying ongoing action, perpetual expansion, conquest as a permanent state rather than a discrete event. But here's the paradox that ancient readers would have immediately recognized. How do you conquer perpetually without triggering resistance, rebellion, war? There's only one way. You convince the conquered that they're not being conquered at all. You frame submission as cooperation. You present domination as partnership. You sell subjugation as progress. Does any of this sound familiar? In 2025, 137 nations signed onto global initiatives promising unity, stability, and collective prosperity. The language was beautiful. Shared destiny, common values, integrated future. But examine the fine print, the governance structures, the enforcement mechanisms. Who holds actual power in these arrangements? Who makes the decisions? Who benefits? And perhaps most importantly, who dares to ask these questions without being labeled divisive, nationalist, or worse? This is conquest disguised as consensus, domination dressed up as cooperation, and it's happening at a scale and speed that would have been impossible in any previous era of human history. Let me give you a specific example that ties directly to our medieval historical context, because the parallels are absolutely stunning. In the year 1309, Pope Clement V moved the papal seat from Rome to Avignon, beginning what historians call the Avignon papacy, or more tellingly, the Babylonian captivity of the Church. For 67 years, the spiritual authority of Western Christendom was, in effect, held captive by French political interests. The popes wore their golden crowns and royal velvet robes with ermine trim. They resided in magnificent palaces. They issued bulls and proclamations. But everyone knew, though few dared say it openly, that they were puppets dancing to strings pulled by French kings. The appearance of authority masking the reality of subjugation. Now consider our contemporary moment. How many international leaders currently hold positions of apparent authority while being functionally constrained by economic dependencies, intelligence sharing agreements, technological infrastructure requirements, and financial system access? How many nations maintain the pageantry of sovereignty, the flags and anthems and diplomatic protocols, while making no significant decisions without approval from elsewhere? The medieval crowd watching a jousting tournament saw knights in shining armor charging with lances leveled, shields emblazoned with heraldic symbols, horses in brilliant caparisons. They saw the theater of chivalry and combat. They didn't see the predetermined outcomes, the fixed matches, the political arrangements, masquerading as martial contests. Are we so different? But here's where we need to address the elephant in the room, the question that's been hovering over this entire discussion. How can we possibly claim that our era is uniquely positioned as the fulfillment of this prophecy when literally every generation of Christians for 2,000 years has thought they were living through the end times? It's a fair question. It deserves a fair answer. The difference is this: every previous generation looked at their circumstances and saw the chaos, the wars, the plagues, the famines, and concluded that these must be the birth pangs of the apocalypse. They were looking at symptoms and calling them causes. They were seeing effects and mistaking them for origins. But the first seal, if we read it carefully, isn't primarily about chaos at all. It's about a specific kind of order, a deceptive order. A conquest so complete, so total, so all-encompassing, that it appears as peace. And that, my friends, requires something no previous generation possessed: the technological and organizational capacity to achieve truly global integration. Consider the infrastructure required for the kind of conquest we're describing. You need instantaneous global communication. Check. Arrived in the late 20th century. You need economic systems so interconnected that disrupting one disrupts all. Check. Achieved through decades of globalization. You need surveillance capabilities that would make medieval castle guards weep with envy. Check. 5 billion smartphones carrying cameras and microphones, voluntarily adopted, enthusiastically updated. You need the ability to shape narratives across linguistic and cultural barriers simultaneously. Check. 6 major technology platforms controlling information flow for 4 billion people. The pieces weren't in place until now. The board wasn't set until our generation. That's not hubris, that's hardware. Let me paint you a picture from medieval Europe to illustrate how conquest actually worked before our modern age. The year 1346, the Battle of Crécy. English longbowmen, approximately 5,000 strong, faced a French army of perhaps 25,000 mounted knights and crossbowmen. The battle lasted approximately 6 hours. When it ended, somewhere between 1,500 and 4,000 French soldiers lay dead. The English casualties? Perhaps 300. It was a devastating defeat for French chivalry, a turning point in the 100 Years' War, a moment that shook European power structures to their foundations. And yet, despite this overwhelming tactical victory, the English did not conquer France. They didn't even come close. Because conquest, real territorial conquest, required holding ground, occupying cities, garrisoning castles, subduing populations. It took decades, sometimes centuries. It required constant application of force, perpetual military presence, endless streams of soldiers and supplies. Now compare that to modern conquest. In 2014, a major European nation annexed territory from a neighboring country. The military operation took approximately 3 weeks, but the real conquest, the part that mattered, happened in the 6 months prior through information operations, propaganda campaigns, cultivation of local sympathizers, and economic pressure. The soldiers who arrived found populations already psychologically prepared for subjugation, already primed to see conquest as liberation. The bow without arrows had already done its work before the first conventional weapon was fired. Or consider an even more striking example from 2021. A government changed, a regime fell, an entire nation underwent political transformation without a single foreign soldier setting foot on its soil. How? Through decades of educational influence, cultural programming, economic dependency creation, and technological infrastructure control. The conquering power never appeared on a battlefield. It didn't need to. The white horse had already ridden through. But let's push even deeper into the prophetic symbolism, because there's a detail in the text that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's perhaps the most chilling of all. John says the rider went forth conquering and to conquer. The Greek verb used here is nikao, which means to overcome, to prevail, to be victorious. But here's what makes it significant. In ancient usage, this verb often implied victory in a contest or competition where both sides were ostensibly playing by the same rules. It's the victory of the athlete who wins by superior performance, the general who triumphs through better strategy, the debater who convinces through keener argument. It's victory within a framework that both sides have accepted. Does that remind you of anything in our current geopolitical landscape? We live in an era of rules-based international order, a phrase repeated so often it has become almost meaningless through familiarity. But think about what it actually implies. It suggests that global affairs are conducted according to agreed-upon rules, that nations compete on a level playing field, that victory goes to whoever plays the game most skillfully. And yet, anyone paying attention knows that the rules themselves are constantly being rewritten, reinterpreted, selectively enforced. Some players face consequences for violations, others do not. Some actions are labeled aggressive. Identical actions by different actors are called defensive. The game is rigged, but everyone pretends it's fair. The conquest happens within the illusion of legitimate competition. This is extraordinarily sophisticated compared to historical conquest. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, nobody pretended it was anything other than what it was. armed invasion, violent subjugation, forced regime change. The Normans built their castles of stone, towers flying their flags, and the message was unmistakable. We have conquered you. Resistance is futile. This is our land now. Brutal? Yes. Honest? Absolutely. But the first horseman doesn't operate with such crude transparency. His conquest comes wrapped in the language of partnership, cooperation, mutual benefit. The subjugated are taught to celebrate their own subjugation as progress. Let me show you how this plays out in practice with a case study that perfectly encapsulates the bow without arrows conquest. Between 2015 and 2025, 146 nations signed agreements for infrastructure development with a single economic power. Roads, bridges, ports, railways, telecommunications networks, power grids. On paper, these were commercial arrangements, investments for mutual benefit, development partnerships. But infrastructure is destiny. When your roads lead to someone else's ports, when your power grid depends on someone else's technology, when your telecommunications run through someone else's cables, when your railways connect primarily to someone else's markets, you haven't just accepted investment, you've accepted integration into someone else's system. You've been conquered, and you probably thanked your conqueror for the privilege. This is conquest at a level of sophistication that would have been literally incomprehensible to any previous generation. A medieval king looking at this arrangement would be baffled. Where are the armies? Where are the occupied castles? Where are the tribute payments and hostages? He wouldn't understand that you don't need to occupy castles when you control the supply chains. You don't need hostages when you hold debt. You don't need armies when you've achieved economic integration so complete that rebellion would mean national suicide. But here's where I need to pause and address something crucial, because I can hear the objection forming in your mind. Isn't this just normal geopolitical competition? Hasn't this kind of thing always happened? Aren't we just describing what powerful nations have always done, dressed up in apocalyptic language to make it sound more significant than it actually is? Fair question. Here's the answer. Scale and totality. Previous empires conquered regions. They controlled territories. They dominated populations. But they never achieved what we're witnessing now, which is the emergence of truly global systems from which there is no escape, no alternative, no outside. When Rome fell, life continued beyond its borders. When the Mongol Empire collapsed, vast portions of humanity were utterly unaffected. When the British Empire declined, dozens of nations gained independence and charted their own courses. But when a global system predicated on universal integration begins to consolidate, where do you go? What's the alternative? Who's outside the system? Let me give you a concrete example that bridges our medieval historical context with our contemporary moment. In 1307, the Knights Templar were one of the most powerful organizations in Europe. They had castles across the continent, a banking network that facilitated international trade, political connections reaching into every royal court, and military capabilities rivaling many kingdoms. They seemed invincible, untouchable, permanent. Then in 1307, on Friday, October 13th, King Philip IV of France moved against them simultaneously across his entire realm. By dawn, virtually every Templar in France was arrested. Within 7 years, the order was dissolved. Their wealth was seized, their properties confiscated, their leaders executed. Now here's the critical question. How did Philip pull this off? How did he dismantle an organization with centuries of accumulated power, extensive international networks, and formidable resources? The answer is that the Templars, for all their strength, operated within a system they didn't control. They used roads they didn't own, traded in currencies they didn't issue, relied on political structures they didn't dominate. When the system turned against them, they had nowhere to go, no alternative framework to fall back on. They were integrated into a larger order, and that integration became their vulnerability. This is the essence of conquest through integration, rather than conquest through invasion. You don't destroy your opponent's power, you make their power dependent on your system. You don't defeat their armies, you make their armies reliant on your supply chains. You don't overthrow their governments, you make their governments economically incapable of functioning outside your framework. And once that integration is complete, once that dependency is established, the actual moment of conquest becomes almost invisible. There's no dramatic battle, no climactic siege, no clear before and after. Just a gradual realization, if it comes at all, that autonomy has become illusion, that sovereignty is theater, that the crown has been given to a rider you never saw coming. Now let's talk about the false peace aspect of the first seal, because this is where the prophecy becomes most applicable to our specific moment in 2026. Throughout Revelation, the opening of the seals unleashes catastrophe, war, famine, death, cosmic upheaval. But the first seal is different. The first horseman brings conquest, yes, but conquest that masquerades as something else, something beneficial, something desirable. And here's the key insight that most interpreters miss. The false peace isn't a lie about the absence of conflict. It's something far more insidious. It's the presentation of subjugation as liberation, of control as care, of conquest as cooperation. Think about the language that dominates international discourse right now. Global cooperation, collective security, shared prosperity, common values, universal principles, international community. Every one of these phrases sounds positive, progressive, enlightened. Who could possibly oppose cooperation? What monster would reject shared prosperity? Only someone divisive, destructive, dangerous. This is linguistic conquest, and it's breathtakingly effective. The vocabulary itself makes dissent seem irrational, resistance appear immoral. Let me show you how this works with a historical parallel from the medieval period. In the 13th century, the Albigensian Crusade devastated southern France. Over 20 years, between 200,000 and 1 million people died. Cities were razed, populations were massacred, an entire culture was effectively destroyed. But here's the fascinating part. This wasn't presented as conquest. It was presented as spiritual rescue. The papal legate Arnaud Amalric allegedly said before the massacre at Béziers in 1209, "Kill them all, God will know his own." The slaughter of thousands was framed as salvation. The conquest of prosperous territories was portrayed as religious duty. The destruction of a thriving civilization was called liberation from heresy. Now, I'm absolutely not suggesting that modern global integration involves anything remotely like medieval massacres. The scale of violence isn't comparable, and making such a comparison would be historically irresponsible and morally offensive. But the pattern of framing conquest as something beneficial, as something the conquered should welcome, as something done for their own good, that pattern is ancient, powerful, and very much alive in our current moment. Consider how contemporary global initiatives are presented to populations, not as transfers of sovereignty, but as partnerships, not as loss of autonomy, but as integration into the international community, not as subjugation, but as joining the rules-based order. The peasant in his rough wool tunic and leather shoes, tilling fields in 13th century France, had no illusions about his place in the social hierarchy. He knew the knight in chainmail and plate armor could kill him with impunity. He understood that the noble in royal velvet robes with ermine trim held power of life and death over him. The power relationship was transparent, obvious, undeniable. But in our modern age, power has learned to disguise itself. We've achieved something medieval lords could never accomplish. We've convinced the conquered that they're free. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the first seal prophecy, the question of inevitability. If this is indeed prophetic fulfillment, if we are witnessing the opening of the first seal, what does that mean for human agency? Are we simply watching a predetermined script play out? Is resistance futile? Should we just accept the conquest and move on? Here's where we need to be very careful with our interpretation, because this is where apocalyptic thinking can become genuinely dangerous. The purpose of prophecy in the biblical tradition is never simply prediction. It's warning, it's call to awareness, it's invitation to choose how we respond to the patterns we recognize. When ancient prophets declared, "Thus says the Lord," before announcing coming disaster, they weren't just forecasting weather. They were issuing moral challenges. Given what you now understand about where current trajectories lead, what will you do? How will you live? What will you stand for? So let me be absolutely clear. Whether or not the events we're observing constitute the fulfillment of Revelation's first seal is ultimately less important than what we do with the recognition that conquest can occur without violence, that subjugation can wear the mask of cooperation, that power can consolidate while claiming to democratize. These are patterns we need to understand regardless of our eschatological interpretations, because they affect how we live, how we make decisions, how we evaluate the claims made by those who seek authority over our lives. Let's explore what resistance to this kind of conquest might actually look like, because this is where the medieval historical context becomes genuinely instructive. In the year 1320, a group of Franciscan monks began openly challenging papal authority on questions of apostolic poverty and church wealth. These were not warriors in chainmail armor. They carried no swords or shields with heraldic symbols. They didn't ride horses with caparisons into battle. They were simply monks in brown habits, armed only with arguments and conviction. And yet they represented such a threat to consolidated ecclesiastical power that they were hunted, excommunicated, burned as heretics. Why? Because they refused to accept the narrative framework that legitimized papal authority. They rejected the system's self-justification. They stood outside the consensus and said, "This is not inevitable. This is not divinely ordained. This is a human system built by human choices, and we do not consent." That's what resistance looks like against the kind of conquest represented by the first horseman. It's not military rebellion. It's not violent revolution. It's the simple, stubborn, dangerous act of refusing to accept the narrative that presents subjugation as liberation. It's maintaining the intellectual independence to ask, who benefits from this arrangement? What authority are we accepting and why? What are we giving up under the guise of gaining something? But here's the challenge we face that medieval resistors never encountered: the sheer totality of modern narrative control. When those Franciscan monks challenged papal authority, they could still travel to different kingdoms, share their ideas in universities, publish treatises that circulated beyond church control. There was intellectual space outside the dominant power structure. But in an age where 6 technology platforms control information flow for 4.8 billion people, where algorithms determine what ideas get amplified and what voices get heard, where the infrastructure of communication itself is owned by entities aligned with existing power structures, where does that outside space exist? This is the bow without arrows at its most sophisticated. You don't need to silence dissent violently when you can simply make dissenting voices algorithmically invisible. You don't need to ban books when you can ensure they never appear in search results. You don't need to imprison critics when you can destroy their ability to reach audiences. The conquest happens in the architecture of information itself, and most people never notice because their feeds still fill with content, their apps still function, their devices still connect. The walls of the castle are invisible, but they're more effective than any stone fortress medieval engineers ever built. Let me give you a specific data point that should make your blood run cold. In 2023, a study analyzed algorithmic content recommendation across major social media platforms. The researchers found that content supporting certain geopolitical narratives received on average 37 times more algorithmic promotion than content questioning those narratives, even when the content quality, engagement rates, and source credibility were identical. 37 times. That's not editorial judgment. That's structural bias built into the systems through which billions of people understand their world. When the infrastructure of information itself becomes a tool of conquest, how do you even begin to resist? And yet, here's the paradox that gives me hope. The crack in the armor that suggests the first horseman's conquest is not as complete as it appears. They still need our consent. If the conquest were total, if the subjugation were absolute, there would be no need for the constant propaganda, the endless narrative shaping, the persistent efforts to manufacture consensus. The fact that such enormous resources are devoted to controlling how we think reveals something crucial. They haven't conquered our minds yet. They've conquered the channels, but not the consciousness. They've captured the infrastructure, but not the spirit. And that matters more than we might think. Consider again our medieval parallel. When Edward I of England sought to conquer Wales in the late 13th century, he didn't just defeat Welsh armies. He built enormous castles, stone fortresses, designed to permanently occupy and intimidate. Caernarfon Castle, begun in 1283, required 12,000 workers and cost the equivalent of billions in modern currency. Why such massive investment if the conquest were complete? Because Edward understood something fundamental about power. Controlling territory and controlling people are two different challenges. You can win every battle and still lose the population. Physical conquest is one thing, psychological conquest is another entirely. The first horseman's bow without arrows represents the pursuit of that more complete conquest, the subjugation not just of territory, but of consciousness itself. But consciousness, unlike castles, cannot be permanently occupied. It must be constantly maintained, perpetually reinforced, endlessly renewed. Every generation must be reconquered. Every individual must be repeatedly subdued. And in that necessity lies our leverage, our opportunity, our hope. Now let's address the specific claim that we are living through the first seal right now in 2026, because this requires us to distinguish between prophetic pattern recognition and specific predictive claims. I am not standing here as a prophet declaring, "Thus begins the end times." I don't have that authority. And frankly, I'm deeply suspicious of anyone who claims they do. History is littered with failed predictions, broken prophetic timelines, movements that declared their moment the culmination of all history, only to be proven spectacularly wrong. What I am suggesting is something both more modest and more significant, that the patterns described in the first seal, the mechanisms of conquest it portrays, the nature of power it reveals, are manifesting in our time with unprecedented clarity and scale. Whether this constitutes prophetic fulfillment in the eschatological sense, I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that understanding these patterns, recognizing these mechanisms, identifying these power structures is essential for navigating our historical moment wisely, regardless of its place in prophetic timelines. Think of it this way: if someone in 1300 warned about the mechanisms of ecclesiastical corruption that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation 200 years later, were they prophesying the Reformation? Not necessarily, but they were identifying patterns that mattered, trajectories that would have consequences, dynamics that needed to be understood. That's what we're doing here. We're reading the signs of our times, not with the certainty of prophets, but with the responsibility of people living through a historical moment of genuine significance. And make no mistake, this is a historically significant moment. Future historians, assuming there are future historians, will look back at the period from roughly 2000 to 2030 as pivotal, not necessarily because it was the end times, but because it was the moment when humanity either successfully navigated the transition to genuine global integration while maintaining meaningful pluralism and human dignity, or failed spectacularly at that task and created something much darker. The jury is still out, the outcome is not predetermined. And that's why this conversation matters. Let me bring this full circle by returning to that monk in his stone monastery in 1312, reading Revelation by candlelight. What would he make of our world? What would he recognize? I think he would immediately understand the white horse as a symbol of imperial pageantry, of conquest displayed rather than merely executed. He lived in an age of heraldic symbols and royal processions, of power made visible through ritual and spectacle. He would grasp instinctively that the rider represents authority performing itself, dominance as theater. But the bow without arrows, that would confuse him profoundly. In his world, weapons were tools of violence or they were nothing. A sword that doesn't cut, a lance that doesn't pierce, a bow that shoots no arrows. These would be contradictions, impossibilities. He couldn't conceive of conquest through economic integration, subjugation through technological dependency, domination through narrative control. His framework for understanding power was too concrete, too physical, too honest in its brutality. And perhaps that's the genius of the prophetic image. Perhaps it was designed to remain opaque, incomprehensible, until the moment when the pattern it described became reality. Perhaps every generation that read about the bow without arrows and puzzled over its meaning was simply too early, living in times when conquest still required arrows, when power still needed violence, when subjugation remained visible and obvious. But we're not too early anymore. We live in the age when the metaphor becomes literal, when the symbol matches reality with disturbing precision. And that forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What do we do with this recognition? How do we live in a world where conquest wears the mask of cooperation, where subjugation speaks the language of liberation, where the rider on the white horse doesn't need to draw his bow because the populations have already surrendered? Here's my answer, and I offer it not as prophetic pronouncement, but as practical wisdom drawn from both ancient text and contemporary observation. We maintain the capacity to name what we see. We refuse to accept the linguistic frameworks that make power invisible. We insist on asking the questions that consensus culture discourages. We preserve intellectual and spiritual independence even when it costs us access, approval, advancement. We remember that every system claiming inevitability, every structure asserting permanence, every power declaring its conquest complete is ultimately built on human choices and can be unmade by human choices. Think about the medieval peasant working the fields surrounding a great castle. Stone towers looming overhead, flags of noble houses snapping in the wind, knights in their armor riding past on horses with elaborate caparisons. The message was clear. This order is permanent, this hierarchy is natural, this power is absolute. Question it at your peril, resist it to your death, accept it as the very structure of reality itself. And yet, that world ended. The castles still stand, magnificent ruins attracting tourists, but the power they represented has utterly vanished. The social order that seemed eternal lasted a few centuries and disappeared. The hierarchies that appeared natural were revealed as constructed, maintained by force and habit, vulnerable to challenge and change. This should give us perspective. Every tower appears impregnable until it falls. Every power seems permanent until it isn't. Every conquest looks complete until resistance reminds us otherwise. Now let me address what might be the most important question in this entire discussion. What does responsible engagement with apocalyptic prophecy look like? Because there's a long, tragic history of people reading Revelation, deciding they've decoded the timeline, and making terrible decisions based on that certainty. They've sold their possessions, abandoned their responsibilities, withdrawn from society, or worse, attempted to force prophetic fulfillment through violence and destruction. This is not wisdom. This is not faithfulness. This is narcissistic fantasy dressed in biblical language. Responsible engagement with prophecy starts with humility. It acknowledges that every generation has been convinced they were living through the end times, and every generation so far has been wrong. It recognizes that prophetic texts are simultaneously specific enough to be meaningful and ambiguous enough to resist simple decoding. It understands that the purpose of apocalyptic literature is not to provide a timeline, but to shape how we live in the tension between this age and the age to come, between what is and what will be. So when we ask whether we're living through the opening of the first seal, the only honest answer is we might be. The patterns match, the mechanisms align, the scale is unprecedented. But we also might be experiencing just another episode in the long human history of power consolidating, empires rising, and populations being subjected to new forms of control. Time will tell. And in the meantime, we live faithfully, resist courageously, love persistently, and refuse to surrender our humanity to any rider on any horse, white or otherwise. Let me offer a final medieval parallel that brings together all the threads we've been exploring. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in Europe. Over the next 5 years, it killed somewhere between 75 million and 200 million people, approximately 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities lost half their inhabitants. The social order collapsed. And people were convinced, understandably, that this was the apocalypse. How could it be anything else? What could represent divine judgment more clearly than plague on such an unimaginable scale? But here's what's fascinating. In the midst of that catastrophe, when every rational indicator suggested the world was ending, some people chose to live as if there would be a future. Monks copied manuscripts even as their brothers died around them, preserving knowledge for generations unborn. Farmers planted crops they might not live to harvest. Craftsmen continued their trades. Teachers instructed students. Parents raised children. They didn't know if there would be a tomorrow, but they lived as if there would be, and that choice, multiplied across millions of individual acts of faith and courage, became the bridge between the medieval world and the Renaissance that followed. That's the model. That's the wisdom. Live as if your actions matter. Work as if there's a future to build. Resist as if resistance is possible. Love as if love can triumph. And do all of this without certainty, without guarantees, without the comfort of knowing how the story ends. Because that's what faith actually means, not believing you've decoded the timeline, but trusting that living rightly matters regardless of the timeline. So yes, we might be watching the first horseman ride. The white horse might be parading through our streets right now, invisible to most, recognized by few. The bow without arrows might be the perfect symbol for our age of conquest through integration, subjugation through consensus, control through narrative. The crown might be passing to powers we don't fully understand, operating through systems we can barely perceive. All of this might be true. But even if it is true, even if every pattern we've identified constitutes genuine prophetic fulfillment, our task remains the same. See clearly, name honestly, resist courageously, live faithfully, and refuse to surrender to the inevitability that every conquering power always claims but never actually possesses. Because here's the deepest truth, the one that every apocalyptic text ultimately points toward. The rider on the white horse, for all his conquest, for all his crown, for all his apparent victory, is not the last word. The seals that open also lead somewhere. The judgments that fall also reveal. The systems that consolidate also contain the seeds of their own undoing. Power that claims totality is precisely the power most vulnerable to the simple, stubborn resistance of people who refuse to accept its claims. This is why the question, "Are we living through the first seal?" is ultimately less important than the question, "How will we live in response to what we see?" The former is a matter of prophetic interpretation, interesting but ultimately speculative. The latter is a matter of practical wisdom, urgent and immediately relevant. And the answer to that second question doesn't depend on our eschatological position. It depends on our courage, our clarity, our commitment to truth, even when truth is costly. Let me paint one final picture, a synthesis of medieval imagery and contemporary reality that captures what we're facing. Imagine a vast castle, walls stretching to the horizon, towers rising into clouds, gates open wide in apparent welcome. Thousands of people stream through those gates daily, eagerly, believing they're entering a place of safety, prosperity, opportunity. The guards wear smiles rather than armor. The walls are painted in cheerful colors. The flags flying from the towers bear symbols of peace and cooperation. But if you watch carefully, you notice something unsettling. The people who enter never leave. Not because they're prevented, but because once inside, they discover that everything they need is provided, every desire is satisfied, every question is answered. The castle is comfortable, convenient, comprehensive. Why would anyone leave? What could possibly exist outside these walls that isn't better, safer, more fulfilling inside? And slowly, imperceptibly, the nature of the castle reveals itself. The open gates remain open because they're no longer necessary. The guards have discarded their armor because violence is obsolete. The walls could crumble and no one would escape because everyone has been so thoroughly integrated into the system that the thought of leaving never occurs. This is conquest perfected. This is the bow without arrows, achieving victory absolute. This is the white horse's ride complete. But here and there, scattered through the crowds, a few individuals pause. They look at the walls with troubled eyes. They ask questions that others have stopped asking. They remember that there was once an outside, even if they can't quite remember what it looked like. They feel in their bones that something is wrong, even if they can't articulate what. And in their uncertainty, in their questioning, in their refusal to be entirely comfortable, they represent the one thing that threatens every totalizing system, the possibility that conquest is never complete, that integration is never total, that there remains something in the human spirit that cannot be subjected, co-opted, or controlled. These are the ones who recognize the rider on the white horse for what he is. Not because they've decoded biblical prophecy, but because they've retained the capacity to see power operating under the disguise of care, control masquerading as cooperation, conquest dressed as consensus. They don't need to know if this is the first seal of revelation to understand that it's a pattern worth resisting. They don't need prophetic certainty to choose faithful resistance. And this brings us back to where we started, to the fundamental question that launched this entire exploration. Are we living through the opening of Revelation's first seal? Are the patterns we observe, the mechanisms we've identified, the systems we've analyzed actually the fulfillment of 2,000-year-old prophecy? Here's my final answer. I don't know. And I'm deeply suspicious of anyone who claims absolute certainty. What I do know is that we live in a historical moment when conquest has become sophisticated enough to appear as something else entirely, when power has learned to present itself as service, when subjugation speaks fluently in the language of liberation. Whether that makes this the end times or simply a particularly challenging moment in ongoing human history, I cannot say with confidence. But I can say this with absolute certainty: the patterns matter. The mechanisms we've identified are real and operating. The consolidation of global power through economic integration, technological dependency, and narrative control is not speculation, it's documented reality. The bow without arrows is being drawn back right now, in ways our medieval monk could never have imagined, by powers that have learned from every failed conquest in history and developed methods more subtle, more complete, more difficult to resist than anything previous generations faced. And that means our choices matter. How we respond to what we see, how we maintain integrity in systems designed to co-opt it, how we preserve freedom in structures built to eliminate it, how we resist conquest that denies its conquest at all. These are not theological puzzles, but practical challenges with immediate stakes. So whether you interpret the white horse as prophetic fulfillment or as powerful metaphor, whether you see the first seal opening or simply recognize timeless patterns of power operating with contemporary tools, the call is the same. See clearly what others miss. Name honestly what others obscure. Question persistently what others accept. Resist courageously what others embrace, and live faithfully in the tension between the world as it is and the world as it should be. The rider on the white horse went forth conquering and to conquer, but his conquest is not yet complete. The bow remains drawn, but the victory is not yet achieved. And in that gap between aspiration and accomplishment, between the crown given and the realm secured, between the conquest announced and the subjugation accepted, there remains space for human agency, for faithful resistance, for the stubborn insistence that we were not made to be conquered, integrated, controlled. This is not the conclusion of the story. It's barely the beginning. The seals that open lead somewhere. The riders that appear are not the final word. And the people who maintain their capacity to see, to name, to question, to resist, they become the authors of the next chapter, regardless of whether that chapter appears in any prophetic timeline. So go forth with eyes open, with courage intact, with the understanding that living in potentially apocalyptic times doesn't mean surrendering to inevitability. It means choosing every single day to live as if our choices matter, to resist as if resistance is possible, to love as if love can triumph, to hope as if hope is justified. Because maybe it is. Maybe the patterns we see don't lead where they seem to lead. Maybe the conquest that appears inevitable contains fatal flaws, invisible to its architects. Maybe the power that claims totality is precisely the power most vulnerable to the one thing it can never fully control, the free human spirit that refuses to bow, even to a rider on a white horse, even to a conqueror who claims his victory is already complete. The first seal may be opening, the white horse may be riding, but the story is not yet finished and we are not yet conquered. Remember that. Live by it. Let it shape every choice you make in these strange and significant times. The rider approaches, the bow is drawn, but the arrow that was never there cannot wound what it cannot strike, and what it cannot strike is the part of us that remains eternally unsubduable, unconquerable, free.